Okay, everyone who's back here on time, I would just like to introduce who's going to deliver the lecture on grounded. And as I mentioned, has written a book just gone into publication on grounded theory, which is a really nice text. So, introduction, please welcome Jane Mills.
Thanks a lot, Mel. Hello, everybody. I did meet most of you, I think. Oh, no, I didn't. A different class, fourth years, I think, the other day. So second years now. I haven't met you all before. So thanks, Mel. My name is Jane, and I work in the School of Nursing, Midwifery and Nutrition. But I also work as Associate Dean Research in the Faculty of Health Medicine and Molecular Sciences. So you'll see me around in a couple of different roles on the campus. As Mel said, I'm a grounded theorist, and so today's lecture is about grounded theory itself. And we've really just got two learning outcomes that we're aiming to achieve with this session. The first one is that we're going to outline the history of grounded theory, and then after that I'm going to look at identifying the essential methods of grounded theory and discuss how they operate in a research study. Okay, so if everyone who's just coming in now could just come in quietly. I'll wait for just a second. And then I'm going to tell you a story, a little bit of storytelling. Okay. Good. So let's settle down and listen to our story for a minute or two. The reason I wrote the story was because I was trying to think at one point of an easy way to summarise the history of grounded theory, which is rather long and torturous, and it's also rather dry. So thus I ended up using a technique of actually writing a little story about it. And I'm going to talk to you today about the Knights of Grounded Theory. So once upon a time, not so long ago, in the kingdom of scholars lived two heroes, Sir Anselm and Sir Barney. Each had trained in the art and science of sociology at the feet of different masters. Sir Anselm was versed in symbolic interactionism, whereas Sir Barney had read descriptive statistics. In 1960, Sir Anselm, who was a very strategic thinker, joined a fief in the Kingdom of Scholars at the University of California, San Francisco School of Nursing. There were reasons for what was then a radical departure for this sociologist of some note. The discipline of nursing had a relatively short history in the Kingdom of Scholars, which meant that Sir Anselm potentially had greater influence there than he might have had with a sociological fief. In saying this, UCSF School of Nursing was intellectually very advanced compared to many other fiefs of nurses in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Edith Bryan, the first American nurse to earn a doctoral degree, was its founding leader in 1918, and indeed her scholarly legacy lives on today. In appointing the 44-year-old Sir Anselm to a professorial position, this fief of nurses invested in his intellectual capital, creating the Department of Social and Behavioural Science for him to rule. As payback for the vision of the fief, Sir Anselm was instrumental in developing a Doctor of Nursing Science program that commenced in 1966, and 2 years later a Doctor of Philosophy in Sociology. Sir Anselm believed that the fief of nurses was a useful community to be part of, because they were receptive to his research interests, driven as they were by symbolic interactionism. At that time in the land of scholars, the very fabric of nursing was being interrogated, which resulted in a shift away from a traditional interventionist medical model of care to an encompassing or holistic model of care. Such a shift meant that this discipline were now very interested in questions of self and action. So in the early 1960s, Sir Anselm's career flourished, crowned by a successful application for a 4-year funded research project examining the experience of dying. So where was our other hero, Sir Barney, while all this was going on? In 1961, he was 31 years old, and having finished his PhD in the rat race of New York City, decided it was time to move to California. Bumping into Sir Anselm at a gathering, he was convinced to join the large research study that Sir Anselm had underway as a research scientist. Sir Anselm and Sir Barney were now intellectually in their prime, and as the Knights worked together on Sir Anselm's research study, they hubbled and bubbled, sharing their respective knowledge and skills to formulate a research process they would eventually call grounded theory. And In the land of scholars outside the cloistered fiefdom of nursing where this research was taking place, the paradigm wars began to rage. Knights such as our heroes were called to arms in a time where scholars pitted against scholars to battle for ascendancy, using concepts of truth, validity, and rigour as their weapons. Sir Anselm and Sir Barney were no different, and together they and the members of their fief began to rail against other knights in the land of scholars who were wedded to research traditions using purely deductive methods of inquiry. Fighting intellectual might with might, together they published The Discovery of Grounded Theory in 1967, firing their first salvo when they stated, "We would all agree that in social science research, generating theory goes hand in hand with verifying it. But many sociologists have been diverted from this truism in their zeal to test either existing theories or a theory that they have barely begun to generate." The battle against other fiefs of researchers, but in particularly other sociologists' zeal for verification had begun. Sir Anselm and Sir Barney had created in their seminal text a weapon that quickly attracted a legion of other users. Using inductive data collection and concurrent analysis, their weapon, even in its prototype, was considered by many a thing of beauty, and for the next 10 years or so, they taught a host of acolytes the secrets of grounding theory in data. Sir Anselm and Sir Barney eventually went their own ways, with Sir Anselm continuing to reign over his department in the Fief of Nurses until 1987, before passing away in 1996. Sir Barney, ever the maverick, established his own fief, the Grounded Theory Institute, where he continues on in his personal quest to safeguard their creation, grounded theory. So you can see from that story that grounded theory, in fact, has not really been around for very long, okay? So we're talking the early 1960s. And undoubtedly the generation of grounded theory, or I suppose the sort of conception of grounded theory, was really a reaction to what was seen by people like Strauss and Corbin as being a quite sort of firm and rigid view of testing hypotheses, which was the dominant view of research at that time. And in many ways, in health sciences, continues to be today. And of course, that type of research is what we can more crudely refer to as quantitative research. However, you know from your lectures that you've been enjoying this week, and certainly with Petra Butner, that in fact quantitative research is really much more complex than just one overarching umbrella term. And in many ways, qualitative research is the same. Grounded theory is one type of largely qualitative research. However, it is in fact probably the most popular type of qualitative research design that's used in the world today. So what do grounded theorists actually do? Grounded theorists are very interested in the idea of process. So if your research question that you're asking is one of how does something work, then grounded theory is often a good fit between your research question and the research design that you're planning on implementing. So grounded theorists are very interested in process. One of the reasons why grounded theory is very popular is because Strauss and Corbin's initial text, The Discovery of Grounded Theory, and then some of the subsequent key seminal texts that followed that by both Glaser and Strauss separately, working with a woman called Juliet Corbin, who was a nurse from the School of Nursing, where he actually spent most of his academic career, are quite prescriptive in nature. And I suppose for people who are interested in qualitative research in the 1960s and 70s, when it was really quite early days in this sort of type of work, the idea of being able to actually have something that told you what to do was a really reassuring type of thing. So the idea that grounded theory has a set of what we've listed up there as 9 essential grounded theory methods means that you can actually step through a fairly structured process in a qualitative research study, unlike other qualitative research designs, which can be a lot more fluid and a lot less easier to sort of hang on to in relation to the type of methods that are used. And I'm sure that you will have heard, or you're about to hear this afternoon, about phenomenology, which is the other main branch of qualitative research that you often hear about. And you'll notice the difference between grounded theory methods being quite obvious, I suppose, and clearly stated as compared to phenomenology, where the methods are less so. So, as you can see on the slide, there's a list of 9 essential grounded theory methods. So what we're going to do today is we're actually going to go through some of those as we explain the engine of a grounded theory study. This diagram comes from our book, Grounded Theory, A Practical Guide. And when myself and my co-author were looking at putting this together, we wanted to try and explain in some way the fact that there are a set of processes which are interlinked and which are very dependent on each other. So you can see that there's a big cog at the bottom, which is really describing a lot of the methods that other people use or adopt in qualitative research studies that aren't necessarily grounded theory, but who want to use some of these methods in their work because they are so clearly described and elucidated in the literature. So things like purposive sampling, coding, concurrent data generation and collection, theoretical sampling, constant comparative analysis, and category identification are often used in what are called descriptive qualitative studies that aren't actually grounded theory studies because they don't move on through the next 2 sort of stages that you can see illustrated in the other 2 cogs on that slide. So let's begin at the beginning. What about data? In a grounded theory study, all is data. And so when we talk about a grounded theory being a qualitative research design, that in some ways is a little bit of a misnomer because, in fact, you can use quantitative data in a grounded theory study, and we quite often do. An example of that is, in fact, Michelle Redmond-McLaren's study, and Michelle's sitting in the audience today, and you have probably met and spoken to Michelle. Michelle's actually going to retrospectively sample a data set from an earlier NH&MRC funded study that contains both survey results plus interview data. So she can sample the findings from the quantitative research and look for some guidance about what she might then go and look for in the qualitative data of that wider data set. So quantitative data can play a part in a grounded theory study, and often does. So what do we do with our data? The first thing that a grounded theorist does is what we call initial coding. And coding, as you can see from the definition on the slide, is a process of naming and grouping concepts and phrases that represent concepts. Quite often in a grounded theory study, you will read about what they're called in vivo codes. Okay, so in vivo codes are codes that actually come from the data. So you may well be coding an interview that somebody you have undertaken with the participant, and they might say something really quite meaningful, and you think, oh gosh, that really grabs me, and it represents lots of other concepts that other participants have been speaking of as well. An example of that in one of my earlier grounded theory studies is a category name called Walking with Another. That study was about rural community nurses and their experiences of mentoring, and one of them described mentoring as walking with another. And that name, that code, then got elevated to become a category code because it was really very representative and had what we call grab. You can sort of understand it as soon as you hear it for the reader. So initially in a grounded theory study, you undertake line-by-line coding in order to break open the data. This is where grounded theory is quite different from some other research designs, because in a grounded theory study, we don't aim to tell individual people's stories. We aim to look for common patterns and themes throughout the data and then elevate those to a more abstract level in order to tell a story about a concept as a whole. So we don't actually tell individual participants' stories. And that's very different from a phenomenology, for instance, that relies on what's called thick description to actually combine sometimes, or even just to use one participant's story to illustrate a theme or a point that they're trying to make. From codes come categories. Often when you start a grounded theory study, you will end up with hundreds of codes. So you may well code the first, say, 5 or 6 of your interviews or of your observational fieldwork sessions or some of your quantitative data, and then you will actually compile from that what we call a coding list. So coding lists in the early stages of a grounded theory study can be very extensive. You can have hundreds of codes in a coding list. So you need to actually, what we call collapse these codes into categories. So you start to look for commonalities between codes, and you start to move them together and think of another term that might actually encapture the meaning of that group of codes. So it becomes a category. Categories are groups of codes then that represent a common theme, concept, or idea. We also use a form of coding called axial coding in grounded theory. And axial coding is coding for connections between the categories that you're starting to construct. And they actually ensure the integration of the theory. So sometimes you might end up, because remember, we're trying to explain a process, okay? You might end up with one or two potential categories, and you're looking for ways that they actually link together in a process that you're going to describe in your overall grounded theory. So axial codes sometimes are words that link categories to categories. Might be an axial code such as communication, some sort of descriptive axial code for action that moves you through a process. So axial codes are actually very important in a grounded theory. Sometimes when we're working with the raw data in the early stages of a grounded theory study, we can use different techniques in order to try and understand more about what we think is going on in this early stage of the data. Sometimes we use a questioning technique. What if? You might have coded a couple of interviews from younger participants. So you think, okay, these people have told me about some particular phenomenon or something that they experience themselves. What if I ask the same question of an older person? Would their experience of that process be the same? So then that would guide you to go then and theoretically sample older participants and ask them similar questions in order to see whether there was variation in the data and responses. The flip-flop technique is when you turn something back to front, upside down. So you look for the opposite of what you're starting to see in the data, and you again start to theoretically code for that. Very similar technique in relation to looking for variation in the data. Far-out comparisons are another way of thinking about the data. So you might have come up with a sort of a beginning grounded theory or a beginning idea of what the theory of the process might be, and you might think, oh, okay, well that's here in the context of this study, which in our case is in Australia, in rural Australia. Let's think about a far-out comparison. What would this process be like if I was in New York, if I was in London, if I was in a very, a country with a completely different culture than this one? So you start to think outside the box in relation to what other aspects you might be missing in your beginning analysis, and then you go and look for participants to actually fill in some of those gaps. Another technique is what we call waving the red flag. And often that's a moment in time in your analysis where you have a light bulb go off in your head. And that actually can happen, okay? So when you have waving the red flag, it means that, my goodness me, I think I've stumbled across something really important here, and that then needs to provoke my thinking around the analysis in a different direction. One of my other PhD students, intern Sari Najana, is doing a grounded theory study looking at the process of providing or connecting care for people living with a mental illness in Indonesia. And she had one of these waving the red flag moments at Christmas time when we thought we'd just about got her grounded theory integrated, and she came up with a whole other aspect by revisiting the data again. So sometimes that also happens, and you have to be willing to go with that in your analysis. A key idea of a grounded theory study is concurrent data generation and analysis. And that's basically where you collect some or generate some data, analyse that, and then use that to guide where you're going next. Because of this, it's often very hard to predict how many participants you will have in a grounded theory study and actually who those participants are going to be. An intern study provides a further very good example of this. When she first started, she thought she was going to go and investigate the process of discharge planning in Indonesian psychiatric hospitals. So she thought she'd only go and talk to Indonesian nurses and Indonesian doctors. She did the first 5 interviews, and she came back to me and she said, well, Yes, intern. I said, how are you going? Well, they don't do any discharge planning, Jane. Oh dear, I said, we'd best have another think about this. Who else do you need to go and talk to then to think about what's going on for people in Indonesia? And in fact, intern had to go back to ethics twice for amendments to her application because of this whole process of concurrent data generation and analysis, directing her study in different ways throughout. And by the time she completed, I think she ended up interviewing somewhere around 15 to 17 different categories of participants that included everybody from village chiefs to people that work in the social work department in Indonesia. Again, that really is theoretical sampling. So we're talking about making decisions about where you're going to sample based on your emerging analysis. Sometimes the strategic decision making relates to where you're going to get the best and richest information from. And theoretical sampling, as it says on the slide there, really focuses and feeds the constant comparative analysis of data. Constant comparative analysis is the idea that you compare code to code, codes to categories, and categories to categories. So the whole time you're going back and forth across your data set, looking for patterns, looking for ways, processes, things that are happening within the data, but you're all the time going back and forward. So you never think, oh, well, I've analysed my first interview, I'm never going back there again. I'll keep on going until I get to the end of my actual, set of data. You're forever going back and forward across the data throughout the process. So, of course, this method of analysis involves inductive, deductive, and what we call abductive thinking. Inductive analysis is really the idea of building theory, building analysis from the data and going up. Deductive analysis is by starting here with a very large data set and then coming down to a conclusion, okay? Abductive is sideways, thinking sideways, okay? And a lot of those techniques that we talked about earlier in relation to raising the red flag, far out comparisons, those type of activities are what will stimulate and inspire abductive or sideways thinking in the process of analysing your data. It's just a small comparative matrix that I put up there so that you would get a sense about the different types of data that you would compare to each other. That goes on throughout the entire grounded theory study. MIMOs. MIMOs are really important in grounded theory studies, okay? So, yes, my friend Melanie Burks, she's a better teacher than I'll ever be. She put together that little slide on finding the value of MIMOs instead of NEMO. And you're going to get to hear from Melanie in a moment because I've got a YouTube lecture from her, which she's going to give you in about 2 minutes, around MIMOing itself. Doesn't matter what type of qualitative research design you implement, writing memos or recording your process of thinking is a really inherent activity. So it's something that you do from the very beginning until the very end. So memos form lots of different purposes, and Melanie's going to talk about those in a moment. But they really are the grease or the oil, I suppose, that drives the engine of grounded theory. So writing memos is the thing that progresses your analysis. And so they are important. They also create what we call an audit trail of your decision-making in a grounded theory study. So they have a couple of different purposes, all of which are quite important. So we're going to click on the click now, and I'm going to this is about 5 or 6 minutes, and you'll get to hear from Mel. So Melanie and I write together all the time, and we actually wrote the book Grounded Theory, A Practical Guide together, and she's at CQ University. She's actually Professor Burks now. I better fix that slide.
Memos are records of the thoughts and feelings and ideas and insights that you have along the way as you're undertaking your research. They are really a reflective piece, whereas field notes are a contemporaneous record of events. So they are much more a record of observations that you have. In my own research, I distinguish them in that memos are largely subjective. They will have some objective elements to them, but they're primarily subjective. Field notes, on the other hand, are an objective piece of writing. Largely what you see, what you experience, as opposed to your reflection on it or your interpretation of events. There are a number of essential methods that we use in grounded theory, but by far the most important of them is memoing. It is in fact the essence of grounded theory. If you don't memo, you will struggle to produce a grounded theory that has the explanatory power that distinguishes it as a grounded theory. We describe it in our text, we describe memoing in our text as the lubricant that facilitates the process of research when you're using grounded theory. Memoing provides you with the opportunity to record events. So in other forms of research it might be considered an audit trail, and certainly memoing provides you with an opportunity to construct an audit trail. Why did you make a decision about who you would interview next? So decisions regarding theoretical sampling, for example, why the data took you to that next data source is something that you would record in memos. In addition to them providing a record of what you do operationally, they're absolutely essential to analysis. The analysis that occurs in grounded theory really occurs in the memos themselves. So while you are perhaps engaging in a session of coding, your mind will be making links, identifying relationships that really need to be recorded in the form of a memo, so that at a later date you can look back and see why you made the decisions that you made in respect of your analysis, why you collapsed codes, why you separated codes, why you abstracted to a higher level of analysis, why you produced a category, etc. Furthermore, memoing enables you to keep the momentum in your research. That's really the lubricant. It enables you to move through stages of your analysis, to progress your analysis to the abstract level that it needs to be. You'll find when you're doing research, all types of research, even quantitative research, has an interpretive element. In grounded theory research, we consider the position of the researcher to be critical to how that research progresses and what the outcomes of that research will be. So someone doing a piece of research using the same data would come up with different outcomes than I would, because my position as a researcher is different in relation or in respect to that data. So when you're engaged in the process of analysis, you will, because of the interpretive element, you may, for example, spend an entire morning, as I have done, I'll spend an entire morning coding, working with a code and trying to understand what it is that the data is trying to say to me. And at the end of several hours, I'll have an aha moment, I'll have an epiphany. I might at that point say, well, it's 2 o'clock, I haven't had lunch, I've got to a point where I can now move forward with the research, so I'll go and have a break and come back to that data and find that I have no idea why I made the decision that I made. I know what that decision is, I can recollect that decision. But without taking the time to memo the processes that I went through, I have actually lost my trail of logic that brought me to that point. And that trail of logic is not just important for me so that I'm not second guessing myself. When I look at my research in the future, I go back to coding that I've undertaken and ask myself, why did I make that decision? Why did I move that direction? Without memos, I'm not able to demonstrate that to myself or to other people who may review my research, such as examiners or critiques who may look at the published end product. In addition to being a record of the activities that you undertake in your research and an aid to the analytical processes and keeping that momentum going, memoing is a mechanism for communicating. So if you're working in research teams, for example, you have memos that you can share that provide your interpretation, express your position and explain your decisions to other members of the team. For a graduate student, that team may include your supervisors. We usually include your supervisors or supervisory panel. A lot of people believe that memoing begins with the first interview, so the analysis of the data. Once we start analysing, we start memoing. I actually believe that your research is aided by memoing from the outset. So from the time you decide that you'd like to investigate a particular phenomenon, that's when you start memoing. On a day-to-day basis, you will memo whenever an idea hits you. And in my experience, that's usually in the shower or when you're driving, when you don't have an opportunity to write it down. We've all had the experience of waking up in the middle of the night with an epiphany, with an insight into our research, a major breakthrough often, and by the time you found a pen and paper, it's gone. So it's really important when you do have the opportunity to record these ideas, these insights that come to you on the spur of the moment, to write them down. I've got lots of notes that were scribbled on the back of supermarket dockets or on coasters at restaurants. Lots of diagrams are drawn on coasters at restaurants because that's what you have available to you. In the early stages, it's really important to memo your assumptions about the topic that you're going to be exploring. So you may have some preconceived ideas about what you expect to find or how you expect participants to behave and what you expect them to say. And putting that down in a memo is a good way of being aware of them. The position of the researcher, as I've emphasised throughout and as we emphasise throughout our book, is critical. I'm not suggesting that you attempt to bracket yourself as a researcher, because the researcher is an instrument in grounded theory, as they are in many forms of qualitative research. But it's really important that you don't impose the ideas that you have or the expectations that you have in relation to this area of research on the product of your research. You'll find that you will write memos whenever an idea hits you, and you may or may not choose to routinely write them after specific events or at different times of the day. It's entirely up to you. However you decide to memo, it's important that you give your memos a title and a date. It makes it easier for you to search for them at a later stage, and the date gives you an idea of the stage you were at in your research when you wrote that memo. Glaser talks about running memos as open. So this means that you will come back to a memo on a particular topic and you will continue to add bits of data. And of course I always add the date to indicate how my thinking has progressed since the initial memo was produced. You'll find that initially the way that you write is quite stilted and factual, but you will find with time and with practice that it will flow. There's no rules. There are no rules to how you write your memo. What you memo will be determined by the stage that you're at in your research. You will memo more about operational decisions early, analytical decisions later on, theoretical decisions as your research progresses. What works for you is the method that you need to employ. The take-home message is memo, memo, memo. If you're undertaking a grounded theory study, you will not be able to produce a quality theory that is grounded in the data if you don't use memoing as a tool to aid your research.
Thank you, Melanie. So if we return to the diagram that we had up earlier in the lecture, you'll see there that there is a memoing arrow that surrounds each one of the cogs. And as Mel illustrated to you in that little short lecture that she gave via YouTube, thank you, you can see that memos really drive the interaction between the cogs, and it certainly drives the level of analytical sophistication of your eventual grounded theory study. So when you're moving through to the second cog, when you're thinking about what we call theoretical sensitivity, intermediate coding, core categories, advanced coding, theoretical integration in the third, all of this is driven by memoing. So it's that momentum that Mel talks about that's really important. So writing as you're going is something that's key to being able to integrate and construct a really solid and useful grounded theory itself model. So a couple of concepts there that it's worth just touching on briefly. First of these is what we call theoretical sensitivity. Theoretical sensitivity is something that's experienced by the researcher, and as Michelle and I were discussing this week or last week, it's also something I think that is experienced by research participants through the process of actually participating in the study itself. So it's that interaction between the researcher and the participant that in fact raises both of their levels of theoretical sensitivity. So the idea with that is that the more personal insight that you have into the substantive area of inquiry, then of course the greater the chance or opportunity that you have to develop a much more sophisticated theoretical analysis or thinking around the data itself. So it results in the researcher having the ability to recognise and extract from the data elements that actually have relevance for the developing theory. And a high level of theoretical sensitivity will in actual fact lead to a much more sophisticated grounded theory at the end of the day. Intermediate coding is the second stage of coding that follows on from that initial open coding where we're opening up the data. So in intermediate coding, really what we're doing is in many ways putting that back together. So intermediate coding fully develops categories by connecting subcategories. And it also allows you to describe and elucidate the properties of particular categories. And if appropriate, you can then dimensionalise those. So high, low, those sorts of things, more, less. Intermediate coding also links categories together, and we talked very briefly about axial coding earlier in the lecture, but it is about linking categories to actually make a process that somebody moves through. So within Tan and her grounded theory that's very nearly complete, it is about this process of connecting care. So what happens in the process of connecting care? How does that actually work? And so her grounded theory describes three categories that stakeholders, so not just people living with a mental illness, but everybody who's involved with that person, move through in the process of connecting care for them. Eventually, the researcher will identify what's called the core category of a grounded theory. And the core category is an all-encompassing category that really describes the theory itself. And so if we return to that example of Intan's study, connecting care is the core category of that study. So the process that we're talking about is the process of connecting care, and that has three categories that people move through in a process of actually connecting. Core categories are highly abstract and highly conceptual, and this is what lifts a qualitative descriptive study to being a grounded theory, an integrated grounded theory. Anybody can do a qualitative descriptive study with a thematic analysis, which is really about just that, identifying some themes or patterns in the data and describing those. In a grounded theory study, the analysis shifts up a notch, several notches, to a much more highly abstract explanatory framework to tell you about a process that exists in a particular area of inquiry. This is an example of a grounded theory model that comes from another one of my previous PhD candidates, who's now Dr. Hoare, Dr. Karen Hoare. She works at Auckland University. And Karen identified a grounded theory of reciprocal role modelling. What she did was she went out into general practice, which is an area of great interest of mine and obviously hers as well. She's a nurse practitioner in general practice in child health, so she's quite unusual in New Zealand. There are very few of them around. And she actually is a partner in a general practice, so she owns part of one. So she was very interested in what happens with new graduates when they come out into clinical practice. She was also very interested in how practice nurses source evidence for their practice. So where do they find evidence that actually informs what it is that they do? So she went out initially in order to investigate just that, the sourcing of evidence for practice. But when she got out there, she realised that in actual fact, one of the main sources for registered nurses in general practice were new graduate nurses. So new graduate nurses had much more developed skills, I suppose you'd say, in being able to source contemporary evidence using things like the internet, which a lot of practice nurses were very uncomfortable with and unsure about. And so, in fact, they taught each other. There was this notion of reciprocal role modelling that went on. And that, again, was another three-part process of them becoming willing. And you can see that there are some properties under becoming willing called building respectful relationships, proving yourself and discerning decision-making. There were some axial codes there of time and confidence that linked moving from becoming willing to realising potential. And in that process, it was around recognising strengths, deploying unconscious expertise. Often the new graduate nurses didn't realise that they were experts in being able to source evidence for practice, and discovering the nexus between the new graduate and the experienced registered nurse, which then resulted in both of them becoming better practitioners. So for experienced practice nurses, that was around routinising ways of thinking, and for graduate nurses, it was around learning ways of making information useful for the team. And they are actually two subcategories of becoming a better practitioner. And you can see the blue circle on the outside. That actually describes the context that grounded theory operates in. And that is in a supportive, multidisciplinary learning environment where there are new graduates in practice. So that's an example of a fairly abstract, well-integrated grounded theory model. To get to that point, you have to engage in what we call advanced coding and theoretical integration. And as I said earlier, it's this level of sophistication that differentiates a grounded theory study from a descriptive qualitative research study. A really good, well-integrated grounded theory will have variation. You'll also use what we call a storyline technique to actually integrate your grounded theory, and that's where I ask people to sit down and tell me the story of their grounded theory. When they get to the point where they think they've got it, I say, all right, we'll put all that to one side for the moment, all those lovely codes and categories and diagrams and bits of paper and in vivo bits of electronic stuff that's going on. Put that all along. Open up a blank document and write me the story of your grounded theory. And if a researcher can actually write the story of their grounded theory and it all fits together and it explains a process in a really cogent way, then they have actually integrated their grounded theory. If they get to a point in writing the story where they stumble and they go, oh, hang on, I'm not quite sure how we get from here to there, then they know that they need to go back to the data, or they might need to go back to the field if they don't have that data already in their set. So writing a storyline is a very important part of theoretical integration. And it also employs what we call theoretical coding. Melanie and I have a slightly different view of theoretical coding from some other grounded theorists. For us, we see theoretical coding as actually finding what we call extant theory, so other people's theories to ours, that actually adds further explanatory power to the findings that you have. So, for instance, with Karen Hoare's theory of reciprocal role modelling, one of the extant theories that she used as a theoretical code was generational theory. So that makes sense, doesn't it? There's a theory about generational difference, and so clearly that was part and parcel of her grounded theory, with the difference between generations of nurses, and so she used that to support and further explain her findings. So the final product of a grounded theory is an integrated and comprehensive theory that explains a process or scheme associated with a phenomenon. So it is explanatory in nature, it is highly analytical, highly abstract, and it also has what we call fit and grab for the reader. So that means that you could read that and see and understand how that would work. And you can actually, even in your own mind, transfer that theory to a different setting and say, actually, I even think for dental students, maybe it's the same. Maybe for new graduates, when they go out as dentists and they're out in clinical practice with the more experienced dentist, maybe they go through this process of reciprocal role modelling as well. So maybe that's something for you to ponder on as we finish today. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm quite happy to take any questions that there might be. Nothing at all. Okay, so thank you very much. It is indeed.
So any of you that choose that may be a methodology that informs your approach in your research protocol that you're developing, please go and have a look. It's a really good user-friendly book. So
great.
Thank you.
Thank you.